Hello, and welcome back to Joomla Development 101. In this lesson, we will be looking at understanding basic Joomla. Now, I realize many of my audience may already be familiar with Joomla as a content management system, have installed sites, or even developed some basic level module extension, plugin, or component for the Joomla CMS. If you are already comfortable with understanding the basics of Joomla, you can skip this lecture and go directly to the next one. For those of you that are interested in understanding more about Joomla, what it is designed on, how it's used, how you set it up, install it, the different folders and database structure that's currently in place, and how components, modules, and plugins interact with your Joomla website, then stay with me throughout this lecture. The first thing that we'll want to look at is what is Joomla. Now, if you're not familiar with Joomla, it is primarily a content management system. There are several other open source content management systems. Joomla is the second largest in the world. And basically, a content management system allows you to manage the content of a website. Pretty simple. But Joomla is actually more than just a content management system because Joomla allows you to control all aspects of a website. Because of the extensibility of Joomla, you can build an e-commerce store, you can build a bidding website. There are numerous types of websites that can be built on the Joomla CMS. And that's where the power of the CMS and its extensions really comes into play. Joomla, from an architecture standpoint, follows a model view controller pattern. This is a very common pattern found in software, and what it does is it separates functionality out between a controller which directs the action, a model which performs various activities, and the view which will render or display it to the user. When dealing with model view controller, and especially with Joomla, we follow object-oriented programming. This is different than other forms of programming because in object-oriented, we're defining things by an object class and then calling those objects. And we can get into more of those details later in the series. Let's start by looking at how we would install Joomla and then look at the folder structure. I'm on my local host, and you'll notice that what I have here is actually a unique file. This one is called the Joomla single page installer. I find this to be a pretty helpful one-page installer for those cases when I need to install Joomla manually on a server and I don't want to have to go through the process of uploading the entire 8 megabyte package, either zipped or 20 megabyte unzipped package folder by folder. With the single page installer, I simply will add this one file to my server, click download and start install, and it will download the latest version of Joomla direct from the Joomla website, and then set me up to begin the installation. If you're curious about this particular version and this particular installer that I have here, you can find it in my GitHub repository at github.com/dbhurley/Joomla SPI. I've placed it at the bottom of the screen here so that you can see it. You can also find it in the slides or notes later. It is important to know that that little disclaimer at the bottom will not show on your copy. I've modified it simply for this presentation. So if I click download and start install, what it's going to be doing right now is downloading the latest file, extracting the zip, and then immediately taking me into the Joomla installation process. By doing it like this, what I'm able to do is not have to worry about uploading a massive file system to my server from my local host and wait for a very extended period of time if I have a slow connection. So basically at this point you would walk through the 3 basic steps of setting up your Joomla website. So you'd pick a site name, you'd pick a description. You'll notice which ones are mandatory fields and which ones are not, because if you don't fill it in, it will be highlighted in red. Trying to continue will tell you the fields that you must have in place. Clicking Next will take me to the database step, and this is where I would define my local database setup. And you can pick MySQL or MySQLi, put in the details for your local host, and define a table prefix. This is helpful if you're on a server where you're only allowed a single database. By defining a table prefix, you can have multiple Joomla websites running from the single database instance. Clicking Next again will take me through the final step of the installation. And you'll notice I've gone rather slowly through this so that you can easily see each of the screens. But you should recognize how quickly this process can be done and how very simple it is to install Joomla. It's pretty nice to see just how easy Joomla is to set up on your own server. You can install sample data if you would choose to, based on a variety of different options. You can have the configuration sent to you, and it's going to send it to the address you defined previously. It will also do some basic installation checks on your server, in this case my local host, to make sure that everything is going to install correctly. Once you've verified those and chosen your sample data type, simply clicking Install will take you through the installation procedure. When done, you'll be presented with this screen, letting you know that Joomla has been installed successfully. The last thing you'll want to do is to remove the installation folder. Now this folder is only used for the installation process. It controls the 3 steps that you saw here, as well as creating that configuration file. We're no longer going to need that, so you can remove that file. After you've done that, you'll see at the bottom you have your email and username as a reminder, and then you can navigate directly to the site or the administrator. Clicking Administrator will take you to the login panel. Otherwise, you'll be presented with the homepage of your website. And it's that simple. You've now set up Joomla. So, let's look next at the folder structure that's associated with the Joomla website. This is the basic folder structure of a Joomla root directory. Now we have a lot of folders, but they tend to make a lot of sense and they're easy to determine what they do. Administrator. You'll notice that when we were looking at the website and I was on the admin panel, my URL is /administrator. If you're familiar with other CMSs, they often will have a distinct URL to get you to the admin panel. In Joomla, this is /administrator. This folder contains the entire administrator functionality. And you'll notice if you look inside this folder, it's very similar to the rest of the website. And this is because Joomla is actually several applications packaged and bundled together as one. The administrator is a fully separate Joomla application running the Joomla CMS purely for the admin panel. It uses the same database setup, it uses some of the same files, but it allows you to have a separate application for your administrator. This would also be where administrator modules and administrator templates, as well as administrator components, would be located. For now, we're not going to go into that in too much depth. If we continue down looking through our folders, we'll see a CLI folder. This is a folder where we can place command line interface files. These are files that ship with Joomla which can be run from the command line directly. It doesn't compromise the security of your website, but it allows you, if you are able to SSH into your server, the ability to run certain commands without having to load up a browser. The next folder, the components folder, is where Joomla components are stored. So it's going to be important, I guess, at this point that we look at components, and then modules, and finally plugins. And let's define each of those terms quickly. Oftentimes, I look at a component as the main aspect of the website. So when you're viewing a page, it's going to be the content area, or it may be the shop area if you have an e-commerce component installed. If you had a frequently asked questions component installed, then the main portion of the website would be displaying the frequently asked questions. If you have a project management tool or a customer relations management tool is installed as an extension and particularly a component, then it's going to display in the main body of your website. That would be what I would most typically classify as a component. A module, on the other hand, is a smaller snippet of code which is typically displayed in one of the secondary locations around your template or around your website. So this would be a module that displays latest news, or it may be a module that displays a tidbit of HTML or a menu. Those are the types of things that normally make up modules. They're different than components because they're not taking up the major portion of the website and they're not necessarily the main purpose of the page. The last one that we'll look at quickly are plugins. And plugins I would consider to be even smaller bits of code. Now you can have very advanced plugins that handle a lot of functionality, but typically for an easy definition, I would consider a plugin to be something that modifies or manipulates the data that's being displayed or the data that's being sent back to the server. An example would be a plugin which is going to take all of the links on a page and obfuscate them before they're displayed, or make it so that they're not clickable unless you're in the browser window. Another example of a plugin might be a plugin that goes through and looks through your content and takes every word demo and replaces it with beta. A plugin will manipulate the data that's on the page. It can also manipulate data that's going back to the server. So if you submit a form, a plugin can capture that response, manipulate the data before continuing on to the server side. So hopefully that gives you a brief overview between a component, a module, and a plugin. The last folder that we'll look at here on the front side is the templates folder, and this is where templates are installed for your Joomla website. Now, we're looking at each of these by folder and how they lay out in a directory structure, but Joomla has very conveniently provided an extension manager so that when you're logged into the admin panel of your website, you simply navigate to the extension manager to install or uninstall, enable and disable any of the components, modules, plugins, templates on your website. The other part that we'll want to look at when looking at a Joomla website is the database that's associated. I'm using a program called SQL Pro, which gives me a visual representation of my MySQL database. You can use other tools. A very common one is phpMyAdmin, which is a web-based script that allows you to also view a graphical representation of your database. Basically, what I'd like to show you here is just a general overview of the tables that are associated with a Joomla CMS so that when you see them, you're familiar with them. All of these tables control some aspect of Joomla. If I click on LP_content, this is where the content items that are pulled by the CMS are stored. If I look at extensions, here's a log that keeps track of every extension that's installed on the site. Now, to define extension, an extension would be a component, a module, a plugin, or a template. So an extension is a broader term that encompasses all of those four types. We can also find specific tables that are unique to specific extensions. And this is handy because it offers a division between the different extensions. So for example, we see here at the top banners, banner tracks, and banner clients. These three tables in the database are generated and placed here because the COM banners or the banners component installed them as part of the installation process. So if you're developing a component, you can have tables created unique for your component and installed into the database during the component installation process. You can find a users table, a users group table, as well as profiles that are associated with users, and a variety of tables which are used for the Joomla website. This gives you a basic overview of Joomla. There are many other tutorials on the web that will walk you through the admin panel, that will show you how different screens look and function. The purpose of this lecture is not to get into that level of detail, but rather to look more at the files and folder structure as it's associated for development purposes. If we go back to the directory structure and we open up the components directory, we see here the components that are installed on this Joomla website. You'll notice that each one begins with com underscore. This is the typical nomenclature for components. If I go to modules, I will see that all the modules begin with mod underscore. Again, a typical naming convention used by all modules. If we look at plugins, you'll see that plugins are slightly different. Plugins are organized by category types or division of labor. So we have content plugins, we have authentication plugins, we have system plugins, and you can even have a custom folder for your own plugins that will run only on specific areas. So all of these folder structures can be unique and created by you for your particular plugin. We'll get into more detail specifically on plugins, how they work, the dispatchers and triggers which cause them to run, and the basic structure of a plugin in the next lecture, where we take a closer look at actually getting into developing Joomla code. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask me. And again, there are some excellent resources online for the basics of Joomla, and I encourage you to download it, look through it yourself, and learn more about the Joomla CMS itself, and get yourself familiar with the folder, directory, and database structure, so that when we start our next lecture on plugin development, you will be ready to begin writing code.